So good morning, everybody, also on my behalf. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak in this conference. It's always a great pleasure for me to be in Estonia, and that is the main reason also behind the fact that I visit the place quite often. I think it's good to say that I will disappoint you a little bit in my speech because I have no videos to show. And I also don't have too many slides because just before I started, I a little bit rearranged my presentation so as to make it fit into what we have already heard better. And I have only a couple of slides to show, which means that you are compelled to look at me a little bit more than you otherwise would be inclined to do, I suppose. My professional career has not been very straightforward, but there is a certain logic behind. At least I believe there is. I'd like to think there is. At the moment, I'm working for the city of Helsinki, and I'm mainly responsible for conducting and coordinating studies related with immigration to Finland in general, and in Helsinki in particular, and the integration of immigrants and the descendants of immigrants in the Helsinki and the larger capital region. Before that, as was mentioned during the introduction, I worked for the place called Kupore, a research institute maintained by the Foundation for Cultural Policy Research, doing mainly policy research related with arts, culture, arts policy, and cultural policy. And my background is in social science, and as a social scientist, I've always been very interested in understanding what makes a society and how societies work. How large groups of people are able to live together, somehow make common goals, express them explicitly, and also do something to achieve those goals, because I think there is nothing self-evident in that. And then, because I'm a political scientist, I've mainly been interested in the political arrangements and institutional settings that have been developed in order to assist the society and the functioning of the society to function well enough. So what I have been working a lot with is things like nation building, national identity, the historical construction of societies, and the relation between the three difficult things: the state, that is the political system, the society, the social system, and the nation, the ethnic or cultural system. I believe that the Aristotle's statement that a human being is a social animal is universally valid, but there is nothing self-evident, there is nothing natural in that people living in a large geographical area or people belonging to huge communities consisting of hundreds of thousands of millions of people, that kind of self-identification and a kind of a sense of unity in those kinds of contexts, that there is nothing natural in that. That means that societies and nations have to be somehow made, man-made, and constructed. And during the construction of the contemporary societies and nations, arts and culture, as I think we all know, they played a very important role in making people living in a certain geographical area to feel that they really belong to the same group. There is always, when there is a construction of a nation taking place, a construction of a national identity, we can look at it from 3 points of view. One is unity, that how a sufficient degree of sense of unity can be developed and maintained while at the same time acknowledging the necessary level or degree of diversity. Then there is a dimension of difference, that there has to be something done to make people believe that Finland is not the same as Estonia, is not the same as Sweden, is not the same as Denmark, and so on. And also in that context, many works of art played a very important role, especially in the era of national romanticism in the 19th century. And the third dimension is that of continuity, that even though all people will change and after generation, that there is some kind of a sense of community, continuity, that we still make the same nation. We can talk about Estonia or Latvia, Lithuania or Poland throughout centuries, even though in fact, there might not be too much that all these centuries and generations share in common. So arts and culture were important vehicles in constructing the nations, and what we could call public cultural policies were also founded in the same period, reaching from the late 18th century until the beginning of 20th century. During that period, lots of, let's say, national arts institutions, national operas, national arts galleries, national museums, national theaters, as you all know, were established. There was funding being started to be given to artists to go abroad and to find influences from abroad, and then to cherish the national tradition in their art. And the arts education institutions were also established during those years. Then we have something different starting from the 1960s or so that we could call modern public cultural policy. And in that modern public cultural policy, I think two concepts are important. The concepts that are very similar but actually refer to different things. One is cultural democratization. That means that the so-called high arts should be available to everybody living in the same society, the Finnish society, irrespective of his or her social status or geographical location or wealth or level of education or so on. So it was one great democratic project. And the other one was cultural democracy. And that meant that especially during the 1970s, 1980s, there was more attention, more recognition of different kinds of subcultures, both traditional, more modern subcultures, youth cultures in the society, and also an enlarging of the, let's say, accepted sphere of artistic and creative forms of expression that, let's say, film and photography were accepted as forms of art. During that period, however, in a way, nationalist thinking behind the cultural policy did not change that much. That there was still, we could find there behind the idea of a national unity, differentiation, and continuity. And what we have now, as has been talked very much also during this conference, is that we have very different kinds of societies, a very different kind of world we are living in than that in the 19th century, and we are in the process of somehow trying to make these societies anew, because the own idea of strict homogeneity, clear difference, and the continuity are not really valid anymore. We have had, during the last decades, the very good recognition of traditional minorities that now, for example, the indigenous people and other groups are now better recognized in many countries. Then there has been the huge influx of migrants, which most probably also will continue. And as a consequence of this immigration, there has been a formation of new minorities. But also the diversity as such has become much more complex, as the previous speaker spoke, that it's not so clear anymore that what the minorities, what the different groups that are essential in the social life and in the individual life, how they actually, what they consist of. Is it clear that people who speak the same language really have the same linguistic and group identity? Or is it something else that actually is important and essential for the self-understanding of the members of the society? And then there is this transnationalism, that national borders do not, in that sense, control anymore how people actually are living and thinking and having social interaction. There are different kinds of border crossing in the social relations that we all are having. Against this kind of a introduction, I would now like to show, I think, is it this that I should? Yes. And I think English scholar Tony Bennett published already in 2001 a report where he compared what arts policies and cultural policies in the Council of Europe member states, I think it was not quite all of them, but many of them have done to confront and how to adapt to the changing circumstances in the societies. And you can read it probably there yourself, so I don't have to read it out loud, but his main conclusion was very critical, very negative, that he says the same that I would like to say, that really we should think these things anew, and not that much had not been done until the turn of the millennium when Bennett was writing his report. After that, especially when I was working at Kupore, I did the similar kind of research on cultural policy development, focusing specifically on my home country, Finland, but also Sweden, which I know relatively well, and the other country where I have been living, the Netherlands, but also a little bit about what has been taking place in Denmark and Norway and in Belgium, especially the Flemish-speaking part of Belgium, looking at what has taken place in legislation, in institutional cultural policy arrangements, in different kinds of strategies, and also what I find very important is how different policies in principle have also been implemented in practice, how much financial resources there have been available to different kind of new activities. And the final conclusion of my inquiries can be read at this slide. That I'm talking about now these Northwest European countries, which I mentioned. The first observation is that even though we might be inclined to think that arts and culture and also cultural policy are somehow progressive, somehow avant-garde, in this field it definitely does not it's not true. That cultural policy as a public policy was very slow in recognizing the changes taking place in the society and starting adapting their ways of working, their basic principles and so on. The second thing is that what we can see about what has been done is that there have been lots of tensions. It has been very cumbersome, complicated process in many countries or all countries. I don't have time enough to look at all those tensions in detail, but one tension is between this idea of autonomy within the arts and the idea of arts used for instrumental purposes in the societal development. And the artists really do not like that much that there is a public interference to their work. The second is the tension between, let's say, a relation between universalism and individualism on the one hand, which is a very strong idea in Western conception of the arts, versus kind of a group-specific recognition of arts and culture, that there is not similar kind of thinking about arts in all group or communities. And that, the last point, is very strongly related to the very difficult conception of quality, that there is a tendency to think in European Western forms of art that there is one kind of one way of measuring quality. You can say what is good art and what is bad art, but when you open up that actually there can be group-specific, community-specific qualities, the whole thing of evaluating what is good art becomes much more difficult. What has been done in those countries has also produced quite modest achievements. So what we can see is really lots of projects, and usually most of those projects have been very short-lived, temporary, and also with very little financial backing behind. As a whole, if we relate to how much money has been allocated to so-called regular arts policy and to this kind of projects related with developing cultural policy to contemporary circumstances, the monetary assets have been really quite limited. And as a whole, I'm sorry to say, we still see very little lasting, sustainable impact. And the last point is also strange. In all countries I have been looking at, the main idea have been that let's say, arts projects for immigrants should not be specifically arts projects for immigrants. The main idea has been that it should be these, because the society is changing. Also, the arts culture and arts policy and cultural policy should be kind of mainstreaming the changes that are taking place in the society, so that it would be the new normal in arts and culture and arts policies and cultural policy that societies are diverse. But, in fact, most of what has been done, most of what has lasted longest has been that kind of a specific arrangements for specific groups, specific audiences, specific artists with other kinds of background. So to make that first conclusion is that, in fact, Northwest European cultural policies have not, at least so far, grown up to the contemporary challenges and possibilities, with Hillier also in one quotation, mentioned to meet them. Meanwhile, we can also take a brief look at what has been taking place in the field of culture and the arts as such. That who are the professionals, who are the people who make art, who are the audience, who are sitting in the audience. Very soon in Sweden there will be a report published which very well and convincingly shows that if we look at what kind of people have been hired to work at publicly funding arts institutions and cultural institutions, there is very badly lagging behind the level of, let's say, people with immigrant origin in these countries. And what is even more sad is that it seems that it's not developing to a good direction, that the gap is growing larger than what it was, let's say, 10 years ago. Then, my final words about popular culture. I have not really done that much research on that field of cultural activities, but it seems that if we look at, let's say, popular music and artistic forms related with that, like dance and music videos and all that kind of poetry and so on, and then films. I'm inclined to think that, to my knowledge, it has been much more open and tolerant sphere of cultural activities than the, let's say, high arts. We need now more empirical evidence on that, but I really sincerely believe that it is so, and we could think a little bit that why might it be so? First of all, it might be that simply the let's say classical art, high art, is so tradition bound that it is a much more rigid form of doing things because of its high level of institutionalization. One thing is that in popular arts there is a lower level of, let's say, educational requirements, that it's easier to start, easier to get into different kinds of activities because we, especially in the Nordic countries where we always look at the diplomas, from which educational institute you come from. Commercialism can also be an asset in the sense that because popular culture works in the market, they cannot afford ignoring possible audiences, and then therefore they have kind of in my mind, I think they might have a more sensitivity to look at different audiences while the society is changing. So much still needs to be studied, especially empirically, so that we really would know what is taking place in the societies and how arts and culture and cultural policies are adapting to these changes. I will end my presentation with this. This is very closely related to what Marco already presented, but my list is longer. It comes from originally from a Swedish theater director, Astrid Assefa, from 2006. Since then, I have made some editing to these questions and also added up a couple of new questions. But I think that these are if we want to really scrutinize empirically what is taking place and why not everything that we think should be taking place is not taking place, these are the questions we should try to look at, what kind of answers we find to these questions in Estonia, Finland and the other countries. Thank you.